welcome to A Web of Stories. My name is Melinda. I'm here by myself today. My daughter is not filming for two reasons. My daughter's not feeling well today. She's got really bad allergies, and even if she were feeling well, she'd be sneezing, so she's not here. Secondly, and I mentioned this in a vlog that went up, but in this particular video, I'm gonna talk about some things and some issues are gonna kind of come up that I'm not super comfortable with her being a part of. So I've decided I'm just gonna do this by myself. But today, I am going to talk about 3 books that at a point in my life, I loved. These were favorite books of mine. But now, it's not even so much that I dislike these books. It's that I disdain them. I'm going to start a little disclaimer here. I am always very careful. I don't want to say anything too harmful to writers who are currently working and to have things misconstrued toward them. I will say the 3 books that are in here, that's not an issue. One of the writers has long retired from writing. The other 2 are deceased. And honestly, in one case, I don't care if it would hurt them or not. But so I decided, I was thinking, how should I organize these books? Because they're different books. They're all 3 are very different books. And I'm going to think, I have them in order of like severity and notoriety from less to most, if that makes sense. But let me go through it. So I'm going to start with one that's kind of like, it's not that huge of a deal. I mean, it is a huge deal, but it's probably not a book that that it's on everybody's radar. And let me go back in time. So when I was growing up, my mother loved to read romance novels. That was her genre of choice. So there were always romance novels around in our house. And when I was a teenager-ish, my mother discovered the author Laverne Spencer. And she loved Laverne Spencer. She would get all of her books. She would buy them, not get them from the library. She would buy them. And I, as an older teenager, probably still a little too young to be reading things like this, but whatever. I started reading them as well. And so my mom and I we loved her books and we would read them all. And so I had great memories of these books. And to her credit, Laverne Spencer can write a romance and can bring out the emotion in a romance, unlike many other authors I have read. She's an expert, or she was an expert at that. I believe she is still alive. She did retire from writing in like the early 90s. So anyway, we're going to fast forward to 2017. So 2017, the world was not where I wanted it to be. There were things going on that were scaring me, and just the world and the country were not doing well. And so I was reading exclusively romance that year because I knew when I read a romance novel, I was guaranteed to have a happy ending. No matter what happened, the ending would be happy, and that's what I needed then. And I was reading a lot of current romances, so novels that were written within a couple years of that time. But I started feeling a little nostalgic, and I thought, I'm going to go back and read one of my favorite Laverne Spencer novels. And the one I decided was called Bittersweet. So she wrote historical and contemporary. This is one of her contemporaries. Contemporary meaning late 80s. I just want to put that out there. Late 80s. And the setup for this one is a woman who is in her early to mid 40s, is a young widow with a 18-year-old daughter who's going off to her first year of college. They live in Seattle. She sells everything in Seattle, and she moves back to her hometown in Door County, Wisconsin, and she's going to open a bed and breakfast. She bought a big old house, and she's going to open a bed and breakfast. Still living in this town is her high school sweetheart. He is in an unhappy marriage. I do want to be really clear about this marriage issue because I don't want to throw shade on Laverne Spencer that she does not deserve. The marriage is unhappy because he wants children and his wife doesn't. I do not believe that Laverne Spencer was making a comment about women not wanting to have children. I base that on all of her books. There are characters in her other books that don't have children. I think it was just a case here. Also, the wife had a job that took her, she traveled a lot. Again, same thing. I don't think Laverne Spencer was making a comment about that. There are characters who do that in her other books, and it's fine. The wife, though, The wife was a villain. There's no question about that. She was very, as I would say, a mustache twirly villain. Like, you just know she's a villain. Whatever. It's a romance. I don't care. And so I picked this book up, and some things were I didn't, were different than I remembered. For example, the 18-year-old daughter does not talk how 18-year-olds in the late 80s would talk. She talks like how 18-year-olds would talk in like the 1930s in a Katharine Hepburn comedy, like this weird kind of, I don't know, the dialogue was just that. It was not a dialogue you would ever hear like in the 80s, but it was funny. Like, I noticed this. There were also some details that did not age well. For example, the female character has to go make a presentation before the Chamber of Commerce. And afterwards, she's talking to the male character, and he's like, yeah, you did a good job. And he says, like, you were a real Donald Trump there. And I was like, no, that's what I was trying to get away from. But whatever, that's not the issue. This is the issue. So I'm reading the book. The husband is with his wife in their unhappy marriage, and they get in a fight, and they're fighting, and then he rapes her. And then I stopped, and I said, what just happened? And I went back and I read that whole section again. I was like, he just raped her. I don't remember that happening. Obviously, it hadn't just recently been put in the book. It was there when I read it, 20 years before or whatever. I don't remember that at all. So, I mean, what happened? One, I could have read it and not understood what was happening, but I don't think so. There is one reference to it later in the book where his brother says, not cool, man. Like, okay, I guess that's a condemnation. So I honestly don't think that I didn't understand it. I don't think I skipped over it. So it must be the third option, which is I just didn't see the problem with it at the time, which is very shameful for myself looking back on it. I am glad to say that I've grown past that. That is not a good thing to do. But this book this book hasn't changed. This is the same book. And yeah, I can't. This book left such a bad taste in my mouth that it ruined every memory I had about this book. And I decided at that point I would not go back and reread any Liv Earl Spencer. I don't think anything like this happens in any of her other books, but then again, I didn't think it happened in this book, and it did. And so, yeah, I'm just not going to reread any of her books. I'm just going to remember them the way they were. And this is a book that I kind of disdain now because of that, which is just too bad. So the second book is actually the book that gave me the idea to this video, because I forgot I had a copy of this book, and I just recently came across it. And this is my book from when I was in high school, and when this was one of my absolute favorite books, although it has been around a lot longer than that. I am not that old. But it's one that I'm sure if you haven't read it, you at least know the story. And that is Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind. I loved this book when I was a teenager. Loved it. I also love the movie. I will give it a few props. Margaret Mitchell was this is not Jane Eyre. It's not high literature. It's a classic in that my definition of a classic is a book that is at least 50 years old and is still in print. That's my definition of a classic. And this book meets that criteria. Now, if you have a different definition of a classic that's like some kind of literary, has to have some kind of literary level or literary value, I'm not sure this book would meet it. I will say, though, that Margaret Mitchell does some really, Scarlett O'Hara is one of the best drawn characters I have read ever. She's incredibly complex. She is both hero and villain, and she plays both of them really well. Rhett Butler is pretty good too. Not as good as Scarlett, but still pretty good. The rest of the characters, completely boring and flat, but those two are really good. And I do want to read one little bit to you to show just a little bit of the genius that I found in this book. Before I do that, I want to show you, this is a physical book. I'm physically talking about the book now that did not age well. This is like yellow papered, and it's very hard for me to read. And I'm even having a good eye day. So you're going to get to see a sneak preview of what I look like when I read. Your glasses. So, setup. And I'm actually going to come back to the scene later in this little bit. But going to show you how Margaret Mitchell was able to distill Scarlett O'Hara down to just a couple sentences. These couple sentences, you will know everything you need to know about Scarlett O'Hara. This is very early in the book. She's talking to a friend. She's just talked to a friend who's telling her a story of another woman who was ruined because she went on a carriage ride unchaperoned with another man. That other man was Rhett Butler. And then afterwards, he wouldn't marry her and she was ruined. And this is what the book says. I wish I had gotten Ashley to compromise me, thought Scarlett suddenly. He'd be too much of a gentleman not to marry me. But somehow, unbidden, she had a feeling of respect for Rhett Butler for refusing to marry a girl who was a fool. And that is all you need to know about Scarlett O'Hara. What she's willing to do for what she wants, but she's still willing to judge other people, that's Scarlett, 100%. So yes, I'm not saying this book is without merit, but there are two glaringly huge issues with this book. First one is racism. This is a racist book. You can't get around that one. Now, I've had people push back on the claim that this book is racist by saying it's not racist. It is a reflection of a time. You know, that whole of its time thing, which I can understand generally that argument in general, but not about this book. I can understand how you read a book about the Civil War or this period in time, which is just before the Civil War. Like the book starts basically 2 days before the Civil War starts, and it goes through Reconstruction. And a book about that time period, and there's some racist stuff in it, but it's reflecting the racism at the time. A book like that, I can understand how that would be, yes, there's racism in it, but you wouldn't call it a racist book because it is reflecting the time. That's not what happens here. The big reason why that does not happen here, first of all, if you were going to write a book like that, you need to be self-aware enough to know that's what you're doing. And I don't think Margaret Mitchell was the least bit self-aware in terms of racism. Secondly, and this is also proof that she was not self-aware, the racism in this book is anachronistic. Racism is always terrible, but the expression of racism changes the way society changes. So, we're dealing with a lot of racism now currently, but that looks a lot different than we did, than to how racism was expressed in like the 1940s or 1930s. The racism in this book is not the racism of the Civil War and Reconstruction South. The views, how enslaved people and formerly enslaved people are depicted in this book is not the way white people of that time would have depicted them. It's not how they would have seen them. This book is the racism of the Jim Crow South, which is when the book was written. And this is why I don't think that Margaret Mitchell was the least bit self-aware about it. Still horribly racist, not better, not worse, just different, but not even accurate racism. And I'm not going to go into all the different forms of racism on this because it's really, really obvious. There's lots of other people who'll tell you about it. It's really racist. There's no getting around it. There's just cannot get around the racism in this book. Second issue with this book. I don't know if misogynistic is the word I would say. Basically, this book needs a big old Me Too on it is probably the best way of doing it. Relations between men and women, and specifically between Rhett Butler and Scarlett O'Hara, are really problematic at times. The most, probably the famous instances of this is about the third act. Rhett Butler ravishes Scarlett O'Hara. Ravish means rape. Like, I caught that one. That one I understood. There's no way around it. And of course she thinks it's wonderful and she loves it. And that's just disgusting. So that's a problem, but it is not just a problem with this book. About a year or so ago, I was trying to look up something else for I think I was working on a blog post, and I stumbled upon a series of articles in evangelical blogs talking about how women need to let their husbands ravage them as a sign of love for them. And then they used that scene from Gone with the Wind as an example of what they should let happen, which that was last year. It might still be going on. I don't know how long they've been talking about it, if they're still talking about it, but about a year ago, that's what they were talking about in 2022. So there's that. Yes, there's also, I want to go back to that scene that I read before. So that scene is actually a very famous scene if you go back to the beginning of it. If you have not seen the movie, you have seen the scene. I'll even put a little GIF in. So this is just the scene where Scarlett O'Hara is coming down the stairs and Rhett Butler sees her for the first time. And if you see the movie, the dialogue where she says, oh crap, I can't see. Hold on a second. Old eyes and old book. She says, he looks as if he knew what I look like without my shimmy. I mean, that's actually a line in both the movie and the book. But in the movie, it's Clark Gable looking charming and, and all that. And that's fine. That was the intent. That was the intent of the scene. And that, I think that was probably a great way of introducing the movie character of Rhett Butler. And I think Clark Gable did a good job with it. But here's how it's described in the book. She turned to start up the stairs, and her eyes again fell on the man called Rhett Butler, who stood alone a few feet away from Charles. Evidently, he had overheard the whole conversation, for he grinned at her as maliciously as a tomcat. And again, his eyes went over her in a gaze totally devoid of the deference she was accustomed to. So, yeah, he's leering at her in a very sexual way, and that's not conveyed in the movie. Thank God. I don't think the censors would do it. I think that would be a hard one to act out too. Lots of reasons. It's probably the one reason why if someone says they're interested in reading or watching Gone with the Wind, I would actually refer them to the movie and not the book. It's also really, as far as like movie adaptations go, it's one of the best as far as adapting a book and staying true to its spirit and its plot and everything like that. Little kudos to the movie, but still racist and this whole other Me Too issue. But at least in that little scene, it's a little bit better. So yeah, this book is disgusting now. I mean, I really recognize now how disgusting it is, and I did not recognize that when I was a teenager. So this book, I actually pulled it out of the pile. I had to go to Goodwill with, this book. So yeah. This is another book that I once loved and now disdain. So the third book is one that I'm pretty sure I'm not alone in, but I also think it's the worst case. Last week when I did my Agatha Christie editing thing video, which I'm going to put a card to up here, I talked a lot about when we brought up her anti-Semitic comments and her racist comments. Is she racist and anti-Semitic, or is she of her time? Are these perfectly reasonable things that they would have said in 1933 or whenever this book was published? And in Agatha Christie's case, she's of her time. She was nothing she said was out of the norm for the society. But this next one, it's a case of an author being a garbage human. So it's not of their time. We're dealing with that now, and this is not Harry Potter. It's not the book I'm going to say, but I am going to talk about J.K. Rowling for just a minute, just as an example, because we are dealing with that now with J.K. Rowling and her very anti-trans attitudes, or, attitudes and opinions that she will not shut up about. People see those, and they're rightfully disgusted by them, but then they're like, but I love Harry Potter. Generally, my feeling in times like that, when there is a book or movie or whatever that you've loved and then the creator turns out to be a garbage human, you still have the joy from those books. You still have the joy from memories of reading those books or watching the movie or whatever. They can't take that away from you. Once that book is published or once the movie is released, that belongs to the world, that it no longer belongs to the author. Now, does that mean you should continue to buy their books? That's a choice you have to make. Generally, I don't. But all of my Harry Potter books were purchased before this, so I feel okay about it. But no, I mean, that's just a choice to make. And I think a lot of people kind of deal with that, with J.K. Rowling or with Orson Scott Card or any of those. But this case, the author, who is deceased, is such a garbage human that this is the book that I would tell people not to read. Like Bittersweet or Gone with the Wind, I would say if you're going to do it, just go in with your eyes open and know what you're reading and know that this is in there. But this one I would say do not read. I read this book when I was a young adult. I'm not a fantasy reader naturally. That's a genre that's a little harder for me, but this is a fantasy novel, and I loved this fantasy novel. I just loved it so much, and I loved the books that were around it in sort of the same world. I read them all, and that is The Mists of Avalon by Marion Zimmer Bradley. So, if you don't know about Marion Zimmer Bradley, here is the very, very, very short story on her, and it is so horrible that if you want anything more, you can Google it yourself. But she was not only complicit in, but also participated in the sexual abuse of her daughter. So yes, so that, she's off my shelf. Like, I didn't own this book. I would never read it. This is a book I would tell people not to read. Now, and it's not even just a case of me saying she's a garbage human, so therefore don't read her books. Once this news came out, I have not read The Mists of Avalon or any of the other books since that news came out. But I did see where people went through her books and pulled out passages that, if you just read it, seem perfectly fine. There's nothing problematic about it. But if you read it with the knowledge of who she really was, that's a different story. She's saying something different in those passages, which is really easy to pick up on if you know what kind of person she was. And they're pretty awful, awful things. So I think that one, I mean, I know I'm not alone on the Marion Zimmer Bradley, with that, but it's too bad because that book was, before I knew what kind of person she was, that book was just really excellent. And it was a book that really held a place in my heart, that is just black and dead inside now because she was such a horrible person. Again, don't read that book. Don't read any of her books, because I'm sure, I mean, if those sorts of things were in The Mists of Avalon, they're in her other books as well. So I'm not going to tell you not to read Bittersweet or Gone with the Wind. You all make your own choices, but I would say with books such as those, go into them with your eyes open, or with any book, go into them with your eyes open. And just know that sometimes, especially books that are a bit older, there are things in it that are not okay. And sometimes those things are ones that are uncomfortable to read, but they are a snapshot of what the world was like at the time. And sometimes they're inexcusable. And, marital rape, inexcusable. The racism and I don't know exactly what word I would say for Gone with the Wind, just the sort of violent and inappropriate male-female relationships in Gone with the Wind. They weren't okay then, and they aren't okay now. And the fact that even with Gone with the Wind, it's being currently used basically to tell some women it's okay for their husbands to rape them is not cool. But anyway, so there's my negative post for a little while. Those are 3 books that I used to love, but now disdain. So if you guys want to fight me on any of these, I'd love to hear it. Put it in the comments. If there are any books that you know of that you have just totally same situation, you used to love them and now they're a no-go for you, put those down too. I'm always curious to hear, people's experiences with books. And if you made it through this video, thank you very much. Give me a thumbs up and a subscribe so you get all of my ramblings, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you.